Have you ever wanted to camp from your bed with two earbuds plugged into your head? It's the summer of 2020 and we've built a pixel pyre, so let's tell ghost stories around a digital fire. It's the Least Haunted Campfire Club. It's Least Haunted Campfire Club. So pull up a log made of pillows and towels and turn down the lights while we unhook our jowls. Make this full screen or else go in blind. Either way you'll see creatures in the flames or your mind.
I figured that since tomorrow is the 4th of July, I would do something a little different this time. This story is not a ghost story, it's not scary, it's not particularly spooky either. It's actually more like a fable. Enjoy. The Moon Tree, a true story. "I've been to the moon," the tree proclaimed to the tiny sparrow that had alighted upon one of its higher branches. The bird cocked its head and looked about furtively in a way that the tree took to mean that the bird did not believe it, but actually meant, "Leave me alone, I'm looking for beetles to eat." "It's true, I've been to the moon," the tree asserted again. In the distance there was a buzzing sound. The tree was a younger sequoia tree, less than 50 years old, and therefore considered young growth. As such, not many of the other trees in this part of the forest gave much credence to the tree's outrageous claims of visiting the moon. Also, they were trees. But this did not deter the young sequoia from telling all living things that came near it that it had indeed traveled to the moon. It told a small ant working its way up the canyon-like cracks and ridges of the sequoia's bark about how after the humans had first traveled to the moon, they decided to celebrate the rather trivial event of a 200th birthday by taking various tree seeds on a trip to the moon. The sequoia was not too sure about whose birthday it was, and why 200 years was such a big deal. After all, wouldn't the sequoia be more than 10 times that age someday? There was a crash, and the distant buzzing became less distant. "Anyway, as I was saying," the tree continued to a squirrel that definitely was not the ant, who had finished its antly business a few days earlier. "They took a bunch of us seeds and stuffed us into a metal canister, which they then put into another metal canister, only this one was stuffed with blinking lights and a few humans. Then they shot us all to the moon." The squirrel twitched its nose and defecated. "All of us in the seed canister were very excited. There were about 500 of us in there, and it wasn't just redwoods like me, no sir. There was pine and sycamore, sweet gum, and good old Douglas fir, 100 of each of us, and we were all going to the moon." "What did it look like?" a deer asked as it nibbled on the green shoots of some wild grass that grew at the base of the sequoia. "Up close, I mean. What did the moon look like?" This gave the redwood reason to turn a deeper shade of red, if it could. "Well, here's the thing. I never actually got to see it. Like I said, we were in the canister, but I'm telling you I went to the moon." The buzzing sound was back. It was punctuated with a crash, and the deer ran off. That night, as the sequoia looked up at a nearly full moon, its blue-white light illuminated the forest in a second day. A gentle breeze from the south caused its branches to lightly sway. The tree gazed intently at the crater-roughened surface and felt the cold light on its needles. "Just because I couldn't see it," the tree thought to itself, "doesn't mean I wasn't there. I know I went to the moon." The gentle breeze became a firmer wind. "And someday, after my 200th birthday, maybe I will grow so tall that I will go to the moon again." "It's a rabbit," said the rabbit, sitting in the shade of the tree one hot summer afternoon. "I beg your pardon?" said the tree. "Up on the moon. They say it's a man, but I know the truth. That's a rabbit up there, as sure as my ears is long." The rabbit scratched the back of its ears by thumping its lagomorphic hind foot against its head. "I guess I never really thought about it," admitted the tree sheepishly. "You mean you went to the moon. After all, it's all you ever talk about, and you never thought about what was on it?" The rabbit twitched its nose, defecated, and then continued. Every rabbit knows that the moon used to be much closer, and one night as a rabbit was moving about, it came upon a coyote. The coyote smelled the rabbit and got very hungry. The rabbit tried to hide, but the coyote's nose was very good, and soon the chase was on. That coyote chased that rabbit all over the forest, across rivers, creeks, and streams, chased it right up the side of a tall mountain peak far above the tree line, and as the top of the mountain got closer, the rabbit knew it had nowhere else to run to, and the coyote was gaining on it. But like I said, the moon used to be much closer. Just as the coyote's jaws were about to close around that rabbit's tail, and just as the mountain was about to run out, the rabbit jumped with all of its might and all of its strength. It jumped off the tallest peak and landed right on the moon. The impact of the landing was enough to push the moon back up into the sky and further away, too far to ever come back. Now the rabbit sits up there on the moon and beats on a drum to let us all know that it's up there. And we thump back on the earth, which the rabbit proceeded to demonstrate with its hind leg before continuing, to let it know that we know. The rabbit finished its story, and there was just the sound of the distant buzzing, followed by a crash. Where did it get the drum? The tree asked. Doesn't matter, stated the rabbit. Men say that it's a man on the moon, but they would, wouldn't they? They're men. But I'm a rabbit, and I know it's a rabbit up there. With that, the rabbit hopped off into the forest. A few days later, the tree was surprised when one of the larger, old-growth trees spoke to it. I believe you, it croaked in a voice that sounded just like large, sun-baked branches creaking in the wind. You what? I believe you, the tree repeated. I believe that you went to the moon. After all, I watched them plant you. A bunch of humans came up here, had a nice little celebration. There were trumpets. Then some man in a green suit said some words, talked about a birthday, and then said that you had been to the moon. The younger tree was shocked. Why didn't you ever say anything? I'm 2,000 years old, the older tree groaned. I have forgotten more things than most will ever know. I watched the forest peoples wander through the forest, hunting and gathering what they needed, never taking more than their share. I watched as they were chased out and murdered by the gold peoples, the ones that came to dig for that worthless yellow metal. I watched as the last of my friends, the grizzlies, disappeared from this land. I miss them so. I've known more animals, bugs, trees, bushes, and flowers than I can remember. Things come and go. Days come and go. The world spins. The old growth paused for a day and a half. Considering all that I have seen, what makes the fact that you went to the moon any more amazing than the thousands of life forms that at this very moment crawl across my body? All of them going on about their tiny little existences, most unaware that they are even crawling on a tree at all. For one of them, a trip to my highest branches might as well be a journey to the moon. Let alone a journey to a neighboring tree? No, you going to the moon really isn't that remarkable. The buzzing moved closer. After that, the young tree stopped talking as much. It thought about what the older tree had said, and after much consideration, decided that it did matter that it had been to the moon. It has to matter, the tree decided. I went to the moon. I'm a tree, and I went to the moon, and that is incredible. And who knows what else I will see by the time I'm 2,000. The man in the hard hat and bright yellow vest checked his clipboard. He was under specific instructions to leave old growth, and only cut down the younger ones. This particular tree was indeed young growth, and there were no little brass tags nailed to it that would indicate it as a specimen of particular importance. He pointed it out to his fellow hard-hatted companion, who started up their saw. The buzzing sound was very close this time, close enough to feel. The young tree looked down and saw what was transpiring at its base. "What do you think you're doing down there?" the tree yelled down to the men below, but they could not hear it. It was, after all, just a tree. The saw began to bite into the tree's trunk, and the tree continued to cry out. "You can't do this to me! Please, please, please! I've been to the moon!" it begged. "I've been to the moon! I've been to the moon!" There was a loud crash, and the buzzing moved on. Postscript. In 1971, astronaut Stuart Roosa carried a few thousand tree seeds with him during the Apollo 14 lunar mission. Although they never actually touched the lunar surface, they did travel dozens of times around the moon. These seeds were then taken to 2 different forest genetics labs in the United States where they were germinated. In 1975 through 76, these seedlings were spread around the country and the world as part of the United States bicentennial celebrations. Approximately 500 of these so-called moon trees were planted. Today, only the locations of 77 moon trees are known. It has been theorized, and in a few instances confirmed, that many of these trees went unmarked, and that many have since been cut down, either for development or for convenience.
This is a short story by Ambrose Bierce. It's called The Damned Thing. 1. One does not always eat what is on the table. By the light of a tallow candle which had been placed on one end of a rough table, a man was reading something written in a book. It was an old account book, greatly worn, and the writing was not apparently very legible, for the man sometimes held the page close to the flame of the candle to get a stronger light on it. The shadow of the book would then throw into obscurity a half of the room, darkening a number of faces and figures, for besides the reader, 8 other men were present. 7 of them sat against the rough long walls, silent, motionless, and the room, being small, not very far from the table. By extending an arm, any one of them could have touched the 8th man, who lay on the table, face upward, partly covered by a sheet, his arms at his sides. He was dead. The man with the book was not reading aloud, and no one spoke. All seemed to be waiting for something to occur. The dead man only was without expectation. From the blank darkness outside came in, through the aperture that served as a window, all the ever unfamiliar noises of night in the wilderness. The long, nameless note of a distant coyote, the stilty, pulsing thrill of tireless insects in trees, strange cries of night birds, so different from those of the birds of the day. The drone of great blundering beetles, and all the mysterious chorus of small sounds that seem always to have been but half heard when they have suddenly ceased, as if conscious of an indiscretion. But nothing of all this was noted in that company. Its members were not overmuch addicted to idle interests in matters of no practical importance. That was obvious in every line of their rugged faces, obvious even in the dim light of the single candle. They were evidently men of the vicinity, farmers and woodsmen. The person reading was a trifle different. One would have said of him that he was of the world, worldly, albeit there was that of his attire which arrested a certain fellowship with the organisms of his environment. His coat would hardly have passed muster in San Francisco. His footgear was not of urban origin, and the hat that lay by him on the floor, he was the only one uncovered, was such that if one had considered it an article of mere personal adornment, he would have missed its meaning. In countenance, the man was rather prepossessing, with just a hint of sternness, though that he had assumed or cultivated as appropriate to one in authority. For he was a coroner. It was by virtue of his office that he had possession of the book in which he was reading. It had been found among the dead men's effects, in his cabin, where the inquest was now taking place. When the coroner had finished reading, he put his book into his breast pocket. At that moment, the door was pushed open and a young man entered. He was clearly not of mountain birth or breeding. He was clad as all those who dwell in cities. His clothing was dusty, however, as from travel. He had, in fact, been riding hard to attend the inquest. The coroner nodded. No one else greeted him. "We have waited for you," said the coroner. "It is necessary to have done with this business tonight." The young man smiled. "I am sorry to have kept you," he said. "I went away not to evade your summons, but to post to my newspaper an account of what I suppose I am called back to relate." The coroner smiled. "The account that you posted to the newspaper," he said, "differs probably from that which you will give here under oath." "That," replied the other, rather hotly, with a visible flush, "is as you please. I used manifold paper, and have a copy of what I sent. It was not written as news, for it is incredible, but as fiction. It may go as a part of my testimony under oath." "But you say it is incredible?" "That is nothing to you, sir, if I also swear that it is true." The coroner was silent for a time, his eyes upon the floor. The men about the sides of the cabin talked in whispers, but seldom withdrew their gaze from the face of the corpse. Presently the coroner lifted his eyes and said, "We will resume the inquest." The men removed their hats. The witness was sworn. "What is your name?" the coroner asked. "William Harker. Age? 27. You knew the deceased, Hugh Morgan?" "Yes." "You were with him when he died?" "Near him." "How did that happen? Your presence, I mean." "I was visiting him at his place to shoot and fish. A part of my purpose, however, was to study him at his odd, solitary way of life. He seemed a good model for a character in fiction. I sometimes write stories." "I sometimes read them." "Thank you. Stories in general, not yours." Some of the jurors laughed. Against a somber background, humor shows highlights. Soldiers in the intervals of battle laugh easily, and a jest in the death chamber conquers by surprise. "Relate the circumstances of this man's death," said the coroner. "You may use any notes or memoranda that you may please." The witness understood. Pulling a manuscript from his breast pocket, he held it near the candlelight, and turning the leaves until he found the passage that he wanted, he began to read. 2. What may happen in a field of wild oats? The sun had hardly risen when we left to the house. We were looking for quail, each with a shotgun, but we had only one dog. Morgan said that our best ground was beyond a certain ridge that he pointed out, and we crossed it by a trail through the chaparral. On the other side was comparatively level ground, thickly covered with wild oats. As we emerged from the chaparral, Morgan was but a few yards in advance. Suddenly we heard a noise at a little distance to our right and partly in front. A noise of a small animal thrashing about in the brushes, which we could see were violently agitated. "We've startled a deer," I said. "I wish we had brought a rifle." Morgan, who had stopped and was intently watching the agitated chaparral, said nothing, but had cocked both barrels of his gun and was holding it in readiness to aim. I thought him a trifle excited, which surprised me, for he had a reputation for exceptional coolness, even in moments of sudden and imminent peril. "Oh, come," I said, "you are not going to fill up a deer with quail shot, are you?" Still, he did not reply, but catching a sight of his face as he turned it slightly towards me, I was struck by the intensity of his look. Then I understood we had serious business in hand, and my first conjecture was that we had jumped a grizzly. I advanced to Morgan's side, cocking my piece as I moved. The bushes were now quiet, and the sounds had ceased, but Morgan was as attentive to the place as before. "What is it? What the devil is it?" I asked. "That damned thing!" he replied, without turning his head. His voice was husky and unnatural. He trembled visibly. I was about to speak further when I observed the wild oats near the place of the disturbance moving in the most inexplicable way. I can hardly describe it. It seems as if it stirred by a streak of wind, which not only bent it, but pressed it down, crushed it so that it did not rise. and this movement was slowly prolonging itself directly toward us. Nothing that I had ever seen had affected me so strangely at this unfamiliar and unaccountable phenomenon, yet I am unable to recall any sense of fear. I remember, and tell it here because, singularly enough, I recollected it then, that once in looking carelessly out of an open window, I momentarily mistook a small tree close at hand to one of a group of larger trees a little distance away. It looked the same size as the others, but being more distinctly and sharply defined in mass and detail, seemed to be of harmony with them. It was a mere falsification of the law of aerial perspective, but it startled, almost terrified me. We so rely upon the orderly operation of familiar natural laws that any seeming suspension of them is noted as a menace to our safety, a warning of unthinkable calamity. So now the apparently causeless movement of the herbage and the slow, undeviating approach of the line of disturbance was distinctly disquieting. My companion appeared actually frightened, and I could hardly credit my senses that I saw him suddenly throw his gun to his shoulder and fire both barrels at the agitated grain. Before the smoke of the discharge had cleared away, I heard a loud, savage cry, a scream like that of a wild animal, and flinging his gun upon the ground, Morgan sprang away and ran swiftly to the spot. At the same instant, I was thrown violently to the ground by the impact of something unseen in the smoke, some soft, heavy substance that seemed thrown against me with great force. Before I could get upon my feet and recover my gun, which seemed to have been struck from my hands, I heard Morgan crying out as if in mortal agony, and mingling with his cries were such hoarse, savage sounds as one hears from fighting dogs. Inexpressibly terrified, I struggled to my feet and looked in the direction of Morgan's retreat. And may heaven in mercy spare me from another sight of that! At a distance of less than 30 yards was my friend, down upon one knee, his head thrown back in a frightful angle, hatless, his long hair in disorder, and his whole body in violent movement from side to side, backward and forward. His right arm was lifted and seemed to lack the hand. At least I could see none. The other arm was invisible. At times, as my memory now reports the extraordinary scene, I could discern but a part of his body. It was as if he had been partly blotted out. I cannot otherwise express it, then a shifting of his position would bring it all back into view again. All this must have occurred within a few seconds, yet in that time Morgan assumed all the postures of a determined wrestler vanquished by a superior weight and strength. I saw nothing but him, and him not always distinctly. During the entire incident his shouts and curses were heard, as if through an enveloping uproar of sounds of rage and fury as I had never heard from the throat of man or brute. For a moment only, I stood irresolute, then throwing down my gun, I ran toward my friend's assistance. I had a vague belief that he was suffering from a fit, or of some form of convulsion. Before I could reach his side, he was down and quiet. All sounds had ceased, but with a feeling of such terror as even these awful events had not inspired, I now saw again the mysterious movement of the wild oats, prolonging itself from the trampled area about the prostrate man toward the edge of the wood. It was only when it had reached the wood that I was able to withdraw my eyes and look at my companion. He was dead. 3. A man, though naked, may be in rags. The coroner rose from his seat and stood beside the dead man. Lifting an edge of the sheet, he pulled it away, exposing the entire body, altogether naked and showing in the candlelight a clay-like yellow. It had, however, broad maculations of brutish black, obviously caused by extravasated blood from contusions. The chest and sides looked as if they had been beaten with a bludgeon. There were dreadful lacerations. The skin was torn in strips and shreds. The coroner moved around to the end of a table and undid a silk handkerchief which had been passed under the chin and knotted it to the top of the head. When the handkerchief was drawn away, it exposed what had been the throat. Some of the jurors who had risen to get a better view repented their curiosity and turned away their faces. Witness Harker went to open the window and lean out across the sill, faint and sick. Dropping the handkerchief upon the dead man's neck, the coroner stepped to the angle of the room and from a pile of clothing produced one garment after another, each of which he held up for inspection. All were torn and stiff with blood. The jurors did not make a closer inspection. They seemed rather uninterested. They had, in truth, seen all this before, the only thing new to them being Harker's testimony. "Gentlemen," the coroner said, "we have no more evidence, I think. Your duty has been already explained to you. If there is nothing you wish to ask, you may go outside and consider your verdict." The foreman rose, a tall, bearded man of 60, coarsely clad. "I should like to ask one question, Mr. Coroner," he said. "What asylum did this your last witness escape from?" "Mr. Harker," said the coroner, gravely and tranquilly, "from what asylum did you last escape?" Harker flushed crimson again, but said nothing, and the 7 jurors rose and solemnly filed out the cabin. "If you have done insulting me, sir," said Harker, as soon as he and the officer were left alone with the dead man, "I suppose I am at liberty to go?" "Yes." Harker started to leave, but paused with his hand on the door. The habit of his profession was strong with him, stronger than his sense of personal dignity. He turned about and said, "The book that you have there, I recognize it as Morgan's diary. You seem greatly interested in it. You read in it while I was testifying. May I see it? The public would like—" "The book will cut no figure in this matter," replied the official, slipping it into his coat pocket. "All the entries in it were made before the writer's death." As Harker passed out of the house, the jury re-entered and stood about the table, on which the covered corpse showed under the sheet with sharp definition. The foreman seated himself near the candle, produced from his breast pocket a pencil and scrap of paper, and wrote rather laboriously the following verdict, which, with various degrees of effort, all signed. "We, the jury, do find that the remains come to their death at the hands of a mountain lion, but some of us thinks, all the same, they had fits." 4. An explanation of the tomb. In the diary of the late Hugh Morgan are certain interesting entries having, possibly, a scientific value as suggestions. At the inquest upon his body, the book was not put in evidence. Possibly the coroner thought it not worth while to confuse the jury. The date of the first of the entries mentioned cannot be ascertained. The upper part of the leaf is torn away. The part of the entry remaining follows. Quote, "Would run in a half circle, keep his head turned always toward the center, and again he would stand still, barking furiously. At last he ran away into the brush as fast as he could go. I thought at first he had gone mad, but on returning to the house found no other alteration in his manner than that was obviously due to fear of punishment." Can a dog see with his nose? Do odors impress some cerebral center with images of the thing that emitted them? September 2nd. Looking at the stars last night as they rose from the crest of the ridge east of the house, I observed them successively disappear from left to right. Each was eclipsed but an instant, and only a few at the same time. But along the entire length of the ridge, all that were within a degree or two of the crest were blotted out. It was as if something had passed along between me and them, but I could not see it, and the stars were not thick enough to define its outline. Ugh, I don't like this. Several weeks' entries are missing, 3 leaves being torn from the book. September 27th. It has been about here again. I find evidence of its presence every day. I watched again all last night in the same cover, gun in hand, double charged with buckshot. In the morning, fresh footprints were there as before. Yet I would have sworn I did not sleep. Indeed, I hardly sleep at all. It is terrible, insupportable. If these amazing experiences are real, I shall go mad. If they are fanciful, I am mad already. October 3rd. I shall not go. It shall not drive me away. No, this is my house, my land. God hates a coward. October 5th. I can stand it no longer. I have invited Harker to pass a few weeks with me. He has a level head. I can judge from his manner if he thinks me mad. October 7th. I have the solution of the mystery. It came to me last night, suddenly, as by revelation. How simple, how terribly simple. There are sounds that we cannot hear. At either end of the scale are notes that stir no chord of that imperfect instrument, the human ear. They are too high or too grave. I have observed a flock of black birds occupying an entire treetop, tops of several trees, and all in full song. Suddenly, in a moment, in absolutely the same instant, all spring into the air and fly away. How? They could not all see each other, whole treetops intervened. At no point could a leader have been visible to all. There must have been a signal of warning or command, high and shrill above the din, but by me unheard. I have observed, too, the same simultaneous flight when all were silent, among not only blackbirds, but other birds. Quail, for example, widely separated by bushes, even on opposite sides of a hill. It is known to seamen that a school of whales basking or sporting on the surface of the ocean, miles apart, with the convexity of the earth between, will sometimes dive at the same instant. All gone out of sight in a moment. The signal has been sounded, too grave for the ear of the sailor at the masthead and his comrades on the deck, who nevertheless feel its vibrations in the ship as the stones of a cathedral are stirred by the bass of the organ. As with sounds, so with colors. At each end of the solar spectrum, the chemist can detect the presence of what are known as actinic rays. They represent colors, integral colors to the composition of light, which we are unable to discern. The human eye is an imperfect instrument. Its range is but a few octaves of the real chromatic scale. I'm not mad. There are colors we cannot see. And God help me, the damned thing is of such a color.
It was the Least Haunted Campfire Club. The Least Haunted Campfire Club. The Least Haunted Campfire Club YouTube show.